Dave, one of my biggest influences in my playing has definitely been John Coltrane. I've noticed a lot of that influence in your playing. Sure. How much of an influence do you think he actually had on your playing and other players that are closely related to him?
Well, I think I'll start with the latter part of the question. I think he's the major influence of this last 10, 20, 30 years. And I really think it's even more in saxophone. When somebody is a great innovator, I think one of the measures of what an innovator is can be seen in the effects that he or she has beyond the instrument into the music itself. And I think, you know, to be a little more specific, I mean, the use of pentatonics, the way Coltrane and McCoy used them, McCoy-Tyner, the way they used them, really, if you kind of would freeze that first 8 bars of impressions, it could be the basic language of music for the last 20 years, and right. A lot of what we hear, especially in modal, pedal point, fusionish music where the chords are not changing. That was a big effect. Certainly saxophone-wise, of course, the way his use of the upper register above the legitimate range, we call the legitimate range up to the high F or F sharp, and his use of multiphonics and harmonics, which at that time was really new as far as in jazz. And of course, classical players have been using it in written music in very contemporary avant-garde ways. But his use of it in jazz in a spontaneous fashion was really new at that point. And of course, I think overriding even the musical influences on myself and on a generation of musicians, especially those who were fortunate enough to see him live, is the spiritual value of the music. It was undeniably played with the utmost conviction and sincerity and unpretentiousness, and really a search for truth and beauty. I mean, it's what we like great art to be. And the thing about Train was that you could see it happening in front of you. You know, we could really witness it. And it was these 4 people, particularly Jimmy Garrison, McCoy-Tyner, and Elvin Jones, who were participating in this incredible energy. And when I speak about the energy, it's hard to even relate it, except you have, you know, now you have some videos that have come out, of course, and we have the recordings and more releases of things that were not released. But in the clubs, this group would sometimes play a tune for 2 hours. And particularly Coltrane and Elvin, the tenor and the drums, would get into duets that could last an hour and 45 minutes, and I saw it on many occasions. So that kind of energy and commitment, and of course the hypnotic effect of that was, you know, just so impressive to all of us. And you know, again, if we saw it, it was more so, but if you even listen to it, the sound he got and the beauty of it was very impressive. So I think that that is really what overrides even the specific influences that you and we all know from the saxophone standpoint.
Right. Yeah. Dave, what were your personal experiences with John Coltrane? Can you describe some of those for me?
Well, again, I did see him a lot at the club, so in a way I was in close proximity to him. But I only met him once, or let's say I didn't really meet him, but I was in his immediate presence once. And it's a nice story. It was at the Village Vanguard, which, as we speak, has been now 60 years operating. I think this is their anniversary year. And of course, it's probably the most famous club in the world. And I saw Coltrane quite a bit there. And the way the Vanguard is set up is there's a hallway in the back that goes on its way to the bathrooms, and it's sort of where you hang out in between sets. There's no real place to be. There's a little kitchen area, and this is the place. So one of these nights, this is around 66 already, 1966, I knew Pharoah Saunders, who was then playing with Coltrane. I knew Pharoah from the New York loft scene, because Pharoah was would frequent the lofts and jam sessions, and there was a lot of free jazz happening at that time. So he knew my face, let's put it that way, and he was a very nice guy. So I passed on my way to the bathroom, and he was standing there, and Coltrane and a few people, and they at that time were dabbling in bass clarinet, I think maybe piccolo, and flute. They were, both of them, playing a lot of different instruments at this particular period. And Pharoah had his flute, and he knew I played flute. He said, "Hey man, could you show me something on a flute?" And I was like, "What?" You know, I froze in my tracks. Now I'm like 20 years old, you know. And you know, I don't know, I took the flute and showed something about blowing through the embouchure or something, you know, no big deal. And then I kind of receded into the shadow, figuring, oh, I'm here, I'll lay around, you know, see what's happening. I think I could hold off going to the bathroom. So I'll never forget it. Train was against the wall. There were 2, 3, 4, 5 people around him. And somebody said, "Hey, John, how's it going tonight?" Referring to the music. And he as was his way, and as I learned through Elvin, of course, and Jimmy Garrison, knowing them, very humbly, you know, he sort of had his head down. He said, well, very slow, you know, he wasn't Southern, but he had a Southern thing about him in a way. Kind of, well, it kind of goes better at home than on the stand. And at that time, his wife was playing with him, Alice Coltrane. I just had to figure, like, you know, he said, well, this is not the greatest night in the world. Meanwhile, I had just, you know, like, been laying on the ground in appreciation of what the set that he had just played. And here he was so humbly saying that, yeah, we're working on it. It's a work in progress, which was his attitude. And, you know, the story is about Coltrane practicing in between sets, going into the men's room or being in the kitchen or being in the hallway. I mean, this guy he was a real practicer. Reggie Workman told me, when you went to Coltrane's house, he always had the horn around his neck. And if he didn't, he was sleeping. That's why he got so far.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, I mean, he was talented, but he was
dedicated.
Yeah, he knew what he wanted. And he also, again, the opportunity to see him 2, 3, 4 times a year in New York. These guys would, you know, the schedule then was you basically did tours around the States. They didn't go to Europe as much as we do now. And they would come into a club in New York, the Half Note or Birdland or the Village Vanguard, and they would play a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 2, 3 times a year, every 3, 4, 5 months. So you could really see, and this is a band that was working. In those days you worked. You could see the band going from stage to stage. And you could always go in and hear Coltrane working on something, and when he was working on something, it was every tune. It was one period he did trills, tremolos. Then there was the period of the falsetto, above the range stuff. Then there was the period of the double stuff, the honking stuff. I mean, it was like that's what he was doing for those last 2 or 3 months that he had been on the road, that I hadn't seen him or hadn't heard him. And here he was exploring that thing. And then you could be sure the next time you see him, he'd be doing something
else.
Fresh.
He was just so into learning and growing. And that was really a great thing to see at that age for me. It was just to see such dedication to wanting to improve.
You think that'll ever be reached again, or do we have to go to play with people like Elvin and McCoy to really try to recapture that essence of that beauty?
Things like that are not done again. I mean, it's never again. Lights, you know, when a light shines and it goes out, it's out. You know, it could be rekindled in different ways. It's like saying, will anyone ever paint like Van Gogh again, or Picasso, or write like Dostoevsky or something? You know, it's got to be different because of the context and the environment and the time we live in. I find it hard to believe that anybody could reach the intensity that group reached. And even though a lot of fusion music used the energy and power of rock and roll in the 70s and 80s, and therefore had a certain energy on the surface, a certain intensity on the surface, it was never the long-term sustaining energy that this group would be able to attain. I mean, they would do it over a long period. It wasn't just a burst for a few minutes and then back down in volume or intensity. It was like, I mean, they just kept, I call it plateau playing, where they would play at a certain intensity, it would raise up slightly, then level off. Raise up, level off, by musical means. In other words, Elvin would finish a very complex rhythmic interaction with Coltrane and McCoy and Jimmy, and then he would settle into playing more straight time to settle things down. But the level had raised of intensity, and then it would go up again when they felt it was time. I can compare it to, I don't know if any of you have ever seen an Indian classical music concert, but a real concert where they're not limited by time. For example, as they do in India. A concert in India can last 7, 8 hours. People go out and have dinner and come back. And in between these, they have it is an effect of like, I compare it to it's like the charge of the light brigade or something. In other words, they'll do this series of things. You can see them really permutating and getting complex and doing all this stuff. And then they just settle down, and you hear the tabla just kind of playing the equivalent of their 4/4 time. And the sitar playing the drone. The cats put the powder on their hands and the drum. They retune. People talk, maybe go out. I mean, this could take 10, 20 minutes, you know, come back in, and then they get ready for the next event to happen. And in a way, that's kind of plateau playing in a way, and that's sort of what Train's group attained. So I don't know if that could be, that chemistry of those 4 people was